The Cold War was a 40-year-long struggle, but for 13 days in 1962, it got so red hot that it nearly brought the world to nuclear oblivion. After America had discovered Soviet missiles being secretly developed in Cuba, President Kennedy was left with few options that could both ensure the security of America and peace within the world. During the crisis, millions around the world began preparing for nuclear war. But in the end, the two leaders and the two nations stepped back from the brink and the crisis was averted. But how did the stakes ever get so frighteningly high? And how were Kennedy and Khrushchev able to compromise? Well, that's just the treasure we're out to discover. I'm Dan Luer, and this is History for Humans. World War II had ended when America dropped two frighteningly powerful atomic bombs on Japan. Their power and destruction shocked and sobered the world to the new realities of modern warfare. But much had changed between 1945 and 1960. The Cold War between the Soviets and America for control, power, and status in the world had so far remained mostly peaceful. But it also led to an arms race and skyrocketing military expenditures for tanks, planes, ships, armies, and stockpiles of the most powerful weapons the world had ever seen, and if used, would ever see. The bombs that were dropped on Japan had the power of 15,000 tons of TNT. But the new hydrogen bombs developed by 1960 had the power of 50 million tons of TNT. And in the arms race, America had a massive advantage, not just with tens of thousands of more strategic warheads, but also having them placed right on the Soviet border in Turkey, which could hit Russia within minutes. And though there is that old adage about keeping your friends close and enemies closer, but that's probably not the case if your enemies are packing a few hundred nuclear missiles aimed at your cities. The sheer power and potential of these new bombs actually had a perversely positive side effect. With both powers in possession of them, it was only logical that neither would dare use them, since the counterstrike would leave you in rubble and ruin. This was called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. Like, you'd have to be mad if you used these weapons if you cared about your own survival. The problem with the concept, though, is that MAD relied on both parties acting logically and rationally, and sometimes some events push logic out of sight and out of mind, and that is precisely what happened in Cuba in October of 1962. And that brings us to today's exploration question for our story lecture, which is, why did the Cuban Missile Crisis almost lead to nuclear war, and how exactly was it averted? But first, we got some history to shovel. Dig it? Let's go. President Kennedy was elected in 1960 as a progressive optimist, promising a bright future for the world and a new frontier for the nation. But right away, the Cold War came knocking. The year before his election, a communist revolution in Cuba led by the charismatic and scraggly-bearded Fidel Castro brought communism right to America's doorstep. Castro quickly then allied with the Soviets and was supported with military and economic aid. Geographically, we must remember, Cuba is just 90 miles from Florida, and such an alliance with our Cold War opponent violated two of America's foreign policy pillars, the Monroe Doctrine and also the containment policy. So when the CIA informed Kennedy of a secret mission to overthrow Castro using 1,400 trained Cuban commandos who were hostile to communism, a reluctant Kennedy gave his approval. The half-hearted Bay of Pigs invasion was a total failure. The commandos were quickly rounded up and Kennedy refused air support for their invasion. And then it became known that America was behind the embarrassing fiasco. Kennedy took full responsibility. On the other side of the world, the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev saw an opportunity in this blunder and looked to test the young leader more. Kennedy knew his resolve was going to be put to the test. The Soviets' first move actually came in Europe, with the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. Now, this is different from the Berlin blockade that we learned about in episode 1. The blockade was designed, I'm sure you remember, to force the Americans out of Berlin. But the wall was designed to stop the massive flow of East Germans into the more free and prosperous West Berlin. This humiliation led Khrushchev to construct one of the Cold War's most iconic symbols of tyranny, and it left Kennedy with little to do about it but complain. On a trip to Berlin, he lambasted Soviet cruelty and the oppression of their system, and then expressed solidarity with the free people of Berlin, saying, All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin, and therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner. I am a Berliner. It made him an icon in Germany, but to Khrushchev, it was just noise and no action. He later told an associate, I know Kennedy doesn't have a strong background, nor does he have the courage to stand up to a serious challenge. If pushed in Cuba, he would make a fuss, more of a fuss, and then agree. However, Khrushchev was about to see just what a fuss 26,000 nuclear weapons could make. After the failure of the Bay of Pigs, both Castro and Khrushchev wanted to ensure the Americans would not invade again. Now, Castro didn't want to just be a pawn and a puppet for Moscow, but when Khrushchev offered to build missile sites in Cuba, Castro realized it was his best defense to keep Americans at bay. It began early in 1962. Soviet military advisors and a missile construction specialist clandestinely accompanied an agricultural mission to Havana. Throughout summer, they began constructing offensive missile sites that were camouflaged by palm trees and jungles throughout Cuba. When Americans grew concerned over the number of ships heading to Havana, Khrushchev repeatedly promised they would never construct any offensive sites in Cuba. And Khrushchev gave Kennedy his word on this multiple times. In reality, he was hoping to have sites up and operational with missiles that could strike all across America before Kennedy became aware of it, and he nearly did so. But then, on October 14th, a U-2 spy plane took photographs of multiple missile sites being constructed throughout Cuba. After careful analysis by the CIA, the president was debriefed on October 16th. This was the start of the 13-day Cuban Missile Crisis. For the first time during the Cold War, the prospects of a nuclear showdown was thrust into Kennedy's unsuspecting lap. Learning his lessons from the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy quickly assembled a top-secret group of national security officials and advisors, including his brother Robert Kennedy, that became known as ExComm, the Executive Committee of National Security Council. This was a 15-man brain trust that would decide how to deal with the crisis before them. They all knew the stakes in front of them. It was only a matter of how to do it while protecting America's national security and not provoking a greater conflict with the Soviets. In the early days of the meetings, most favored an airstrike, followed by an invasion as the only way to guarantee the removal of the missiles. Kennedy was unsure though. What if they hadn't found all the sites, and the airstrikes left some still standing? Would Soviets die in such an attack? Would they respond to such aggression with military action? For every if, there was an equally frightening then to consider. After nearly a week, Kennedy began to lean towards deploying a naval blockade around Cuba. Problem was, a blockade was an act of war and did little to nothing about the missiles that were already there. Still, it was a show of force, a flex of military muscle, and more than that, it put the ball into Khrushchev's court. The peace would now be his to lose. So, on October 22nd, Kennedy spoke directly to the nation in the most sobering and somber live broadcast in the history of television. Families around the world gathered around their televisions and leaned into Kennedy, gravely announcing the discovery of missiles in Cuba. He announced not a blockade, but a quarantine that would allow essential goods but prevent military supplies into the island. And he made it perfectly clear that if the missiles were not removed, America would not hesitate to take decisive action against the Soviets if pushed to do so. Kennedy stated the 1930s taught us a clear lesson. Aggressive conduct, if allowed to go unchecked and unchallenged, ultimately leads to war. We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the costs of worldwide nuclear war, in which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. But neither will we shrink from that risk at any time it must be faced. Though he showed strength and resolve, Khrushchev looked to see if Kennedy would put his missiles where his mouth was. He fired back that the blockade was a reckless and lawless act of aggression, and that Soviet ships would not respect or obey it. For the next 2 days, a game of nuclear chicken commenced, and millions around the world shared a similar sense of doom. Americans ransacked grocery stores, hoarded food, prepared bomb shelters, evacuation plans were developed, and thousands fled from urban centers, while peace activists took to the streets. And 180 American warships surrounded Cuba as 200,000 troops readied in Florida, the largest mobilization since World War II. As the blockade patrolled, ExComm continued to meet. and new intelligence and photographs showed the construction of the sites continued with haste. For the first and only time during the Cold War, the American military was put on DEFCON 2, one step away from nuclear war. For 24 hours a day, nuclear-armed planes circled the skies just outside the Soviet Union. 145 intercontinental ballistic missiles took aim. Submarines patrolled the dark waters outside the Soviet Union, and all were ready to strike in a moment's notice. Messages from Khrushchev began to reveal a nervousness, and then an appeal for peace. The following day, on October 25th, 14 ships loaded with missile equipment that left for Cuba but were still quite far from the blockade were called back and reversed course heading back to the Soviet Union. The Secretary of State stated, "We are eye to eye, and I think the other fella just blinked." The blockade, it seemed, had worked. The next day, though, Castro believed an invasion was at hand and asked Khrushchev to launch a preemptive nuclear strike against America. But Khrushchev wouldn't, and instead proposed a compromise. If America publicly announced it would never invade Cuba again, they would remove the missiles. The next day, another message was sent, asking America to also remove its missiles from Turkey as part of the deal. But before America could accept, a U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, killing the American pilot. And then hours later, a nuclear-armed Soviet submarine off the coast of Cuba was hit with a small depth charge to get them to surface. This was misunderstood, and the officers aboard believed war above had started. 2 of the 3 men needed to launch a nuclear-armed torpedo against the Americans gave the go-ahead. But the second in command, Vasily Arkhipov, believed it had been a mistake, and he remained calm and refused the attack on American ships. He was a forgotten hero who might have well saved hundreds of millions of men. And above the water, the 2 leaders were finally going to defuse the larger situation at hand. In the final compromise, America promised to respect Cuba's sovereignty and would privately remove the missiles from Turkey in several months in exchange for the removal of the Cuban missiles. After 13 days, the crisis was settled. The fever broke, and both nations stepped back from the brink and the approaching abyss. Kennedy came out looking to have bested Khrushchev in the deal, but history shines favorably on both men for being willing to stand against pressures at home and instead make room for peace. The crisis demonstrated how quickly and dangerously the Cold War could turn, and in its aftermath, measures were taken to ensure it wouldn't happen again. A hotline, which was a direct communication line between Moscow and DC to defuse future emergencies, was installed. And in the following year, America, the Soviets, and Britain signed the first limited nuclear test ban treaty, which was the first major step of cooperation to control the dangers of nuclear weapons. And as citizens in the 21st century, with more and more nations possessing nuclear weapons in a rapidly changing world, we best learn what we can from the Cuban Missile Crisis and act on it. We don't want to learn to just step away from the brink when it approaches, but move together in a direction that makes nuclear war unthinkable, impossible, and left forever to the pages of history. And thanks for engaging today. This has been History for Humans. And now what you've all been waiting for.
Dad jokes in history!
What did Khrushchev bring to Castro's Christmas party? Mistletoe. Mistletoe. Aha! If you enjoyed that or enjoyed the episode, it would be awesome if you just took a second and clicked to show it. It's like a free donation and it helps me, a teacher, make more episodes so that we can move forward together. And if you click to subscribe, you'll get notified each and every time we drop a new video. And if you have an idea for an awesome story in U.S. history and you want me to cover it, drop it below. And like always, you can head over to our website, www.historyforhumans.com, and engage with students from around the country in forums and discussions. And for teachers, there's lesson plans and resources, freebies, and other goodies there. And regardless, I really appreciate you guys for watching and thank you for tuning in. And if you're doing the learning activity, hang out because we got directions in just a second. All right, today's lesson is a good one and it puts you in the driver's seat of history. And although you could do this alone, you should be working in a small group so that you'll be acting like XCOM, Kennedy's national security advisors, trying to solve the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, I know you already know how Kennedy handled it, so you can surely make the same decision as him, but you don't have to. It's for you and your advisors to decide. Now, what you're first going to be doing is reading some top secret background information, and you're going to view aerial photographs of the missile sites and then answer some questions on both. Then, the fun part is when you get to weigh the pros and cons of each of the options you consider. You're also going to have to consider what are the unintended consequences. What could potentially go wrong? How might the Soviets respond to each? And then lastly, in the final part, you're going to be writing a short speech to the nation as if you were Kennedy. So be creative, think critically, act cooperatively, and for heaven's sake, have some fun. Learning is such a privilege. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll catch you next time.